Bonjour, good morning. I'm pleased to be here. I always have difficulty following on introductions like that. I just accused Phil of calling me beautiful. I think he said that, didn't he? I just wanted to confirm that. He called me beautiful, so that tops certainly the introduction I got a few years ago when I was speaking at another university where a young lady was indeed provided with biographical material about me. The media relations people in the Department of Justice are very aggressive about making sure that you're always keeping first of all, you have to have a CV, and then a curriculum vitae, and then you have to keep it up to date, which is always a pain for me to do. So they made me write one of these things, and then they embellished it a bit, and they gave it to this young lady who had to introduce me, and she was standing there looking at it, and she stood up and she said, well, I'm not sure that I want to read all of this stuff that they gave me about Judge Sinclair to you, and I've looked at it, and all I can say is that he's a well-rounded individual. With which, of course, I have to agree. But now, in addition to that, I'm beautiful, and I want you to know that I really appreciate that. Notoriety is a two-edged sword, and we have to be careful about how we handle it, particularly in my capacity as a judge, because sometimes it can go to your head, and that happened to me shortly after the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry report came out about 3 or 4 years ago. I was walking through one of the malls that Winnipeg is famous for with my daughter, and this young fellow came running up to me really hard, and he was, for a moment I thought maybe he was somebody that I'd sent to jail and he was going to seek his revenge, but he came running up to me and he grabbed me by the arm and he said, "Sir, I just want you to know that I'm very proud to know you. I'm very proud that you're an Aboriginal person, and I am too, and I want you to know that I'm really happy that you're doing the good work that you do." And of course I was, in my usual humble way, I was thankful for what he said, and I said, "Thank you very much." He said, "And I want you to come and meet my family," he said. So he dragged me down this small hallway to the food court where there was a bunch of people sitting there, and introduced me to his wife and their 4 or 5 kids, and he said, "Kids, I want you to know that this is a very important day for you because this is the day that you met Elijah Harper." I wasn't about to correct him because I thought not only would I be humiliated by it, but I thought he would be too. So I didn't want to denigrate him in the eyes of his obviously loving and adoring family. And I was just going to take my leave and get out of there. But unfortunately, one of his daughters piped up and said, "Sir, can I have your autograph?" So I signed Elijah's name. I told Elijah about that later, and he and I agreed that from now on I'd have to wear a T-shirt that said, "I am not Elijah Harper." And I said I would do that willingly. When called upon to address this gathering of people involved in areas of family violence and counseling of people involved in family situations, including young people in this province, I'm always struck at what exactly it is that I should be talking to you about. For the most part, most of you are involved in the day-to-day affairs of family counseling and youth counseling and counseling of married couples. And me, as a judge, I'm brought into the situation where family violence is concerned, usually at the tail end of things. I'm involved in a situation where the problems that are presented to us as judges are usually the end result of a long and usually sad history of affairs going on within families. And so I'm often struck at the question as to what is it that a judge can bring to a discussion like this. And when I was asked to come and talk to you, it struck me that obviously one of the issues that judges should be called upon to talk about is to talk about the issue of what we do and how we do things and what concerns we have at that end of the process about what we're called upon to do. So I want to talk to you today about particularly the issue of sentencing in cases of family violence, and particularly the kinds of things that we as judges are confronted with and some of the developments that we see happening, particularly in the Aboriginal community, because that's an area that seems to be developing approaches to family violence and sexual offenses internal to families that appear to be having some positive progress, some positive things to say. And perhaps there are lessons for us in the court and for society generally that we can learn from those kinds of events. I was on a number of occasions called upon to talk about crime in the Aboriginal community, and let me begin by addressing that because it seems to me that one of the most misunderstood issues that we're faced with today is the issue of what's going on in the Aboriginal community, both from the perspective of problems and from the perspective of solutions. When I was growing up in Manitoba, I was raised in a community in which we as Aboriginal people didn't have a lot that we could be thankful for as a result of our Aboriginality. That's a phrase that I coined, incidentally. But it's because we were in the throes, I could say, of a process in which Aboriginal identity was not something that we were given with a great deal of pride. Being raised in the 50s and 60s in this province, we were raised with images about ourselves as Aboriginal youth, Aboriginal people. It was very negative, and that negativity was a result of a long history of information and disinformation that had been provided throughout society. We saw images of ourselves in writing and images of ourselves in books and in movies and in television that were not merely not positive, but were extremely negative. We saw images about our culture and stories about our language that caused us to feel embarrassment over what we were. I still remember when I was going to school being quite embarrassed by the fact that we, all of us Aboriginal people, were responsible for slaughtering missionaries at the stake and eating out their hearts and doing all sorts of vile and ugly things to them. While at the same time, similar things, of course, were being done to Aboriginal people, but we weren't told about that. And at the same time, those things were being done to non-Aboriginal people as well, but we weren't told about that. The images that we had of ourselves as Aboriginal people, therefore, growing up, were extremely negative. But it wasn't just that caused us to have negative impressions about ourselves. I want to talk a little bit about that history, if I can, because it has resulted in the situation that we have today. We have a situation in Manitoba where about 60 to 70% of all of the men who are locked up in our jails are Aboriginal men. We have a situation where almost 90% of the women who are locked up in our jails are Aboriginal women. About 70% of all of the young people under the age of 18 who are locked up in our youth system are Aboriginal. We have a situation in which those who are charged with domestic violence, almost 55% of the people who are prosecuted in the domestic violence courts of our province are Aboriginal people. And yet Aboriginal people make up only 12% of the population. And I wonder why that is so. We had a chance to study that in the course of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. And one of the interesting things that we discovered was that it was not always that way. I had grown up in the belief, not just my belief, but the belief of society generally, that Aboriginal people were somehow inherently defective. That somehow there was something wrong with us in the way that we did things, and that explained why it was that we were not at the top of the scale, so to speak. That is why when we were growing up, we were told that we had to overcome our Aboriginalness. We had to overcome our Indian identity, that we had to ignore it if we could, put it out of the way, that we had to deal with society on its terms, and those terms included that we could not achieve anything if we made a big issue of being Indian. And those thoughts struck me as we were doing the AJI as something that we should address, because the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry process